There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or a shared joke, or a simple, thoughtless gesture. You don't recognize them as watersheds at the time. There is no thunderclap, no sudden shift in the light. But later, when you trace the map of your life backward, you find a single, indelible point where the landscape changed forever. A place where the river of your existence bent in its bed and began to carve a new path through the terrain of who you were. For me, that moment was not a grand declaration or a dramatic event. It was the span of 3 heartbeats in a dimly lit hallway. It was the weight of a body against mine, the scent of soap and sleep, and a silence that said more than a lifetime of words ever could. It was the moment a joke was supposed to end and didn't. The joke itself was stupid, a relic of the physical, thoughtless roughhousing that punctuated our friendship. Julian had a habit of expressing every emotion with his whole body. Joy was him lifting you off the ground in a hug that threatened your ribs. Frustration was him pacing the length of our apartment like a caged animal. And playfulness, apparently, was this. He had cornered me as I was coming out of the bathroom, a towel around my waist, water dripping from my hair onto the worn floorboards. He'd been laughing about something I'd said, a dry, throwaway comment about the questionable state of the leftovers in our fridge. His laughter was a full-body event, starting in his chest and radiating outward. He'd pressed forward, hands flat on the wall on either side of my head, caging me in. "You take that back," he demanded, his voice thick with amusement, his eyes bright with the kind of uncomplicated mirth I had spent years cataloging from a safe distance. It was a common scene, a familiar note in the symphony of our shared life. I was supposed to struggle playfully, to shove him back, to trade another volley of insults until the moment dissolved back into the easy rhythm of our cohabitation. But this time, something was different. I played my part, rolling my eyes. "Never," I said, my voice steady despite the sudden, frantic beat of my own heart. His proximity was nothing new, and yet, tonight it felt fundamentally altered. It was like looking at a photograph you've seen 1,000 times, and suddenly noticing a detail in the background that changes its entire meaning. His laughter subsided, but he didn't move. The smile on his face didn't vanish, but it softened, melting at the edges until it was just a quiet, questioning curve of his lips. The space between us, usually crackling with fraternal energy, became dense, heavy, and strangely fragile. I could feel the heat radiating from his chest, could count the tiny, pale freckles scattered across the bridge of his nose. His eyes, the color of moss after a rainstorm, lost their playful glint and became deep, dark pools of something I couldn't name. And he just stayed. The joke was over. The punchline had been delivered and had faded into the quiet hum of the refrigerator down the hall. But he remained, his arms locked, his body a warm, solid barrier. The air grew thick with unspoken questions. My own breath hitched in my throat, and I watched as his gaze dropped from my eyes to my mouth and then back up again. 3 heartbeats. That's how long it lasted. The first was a question mark. The second was a long, slow drawing in of breath. The third was the moment he finally seemed to realize what he was doing, the spell breaking. A flicker of panic, of pure, unadulterated confusion, crossed his face before he pushed himself off the wall so abruptly he stumbled backward. He didn't look at me. He just ran a hand through his already messy hair and muttered something about being tired before disappearing into his room, closing the door behind him with a soft, definitive click. I stood there in the hallway, the cool air hitting my damp skin where his warmth had been, and I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and electrifying, that nothing would ever be ordinary again. To understand the weight of that silence in the hallway, you have to understand the foundation upon which it was built. Julian and I had been friends for 8 years, roommates for 4. We met in a sophomore-level software engineering class I was taking as an elective, a class I was hopelessly, spectacularly failing. I was a photography major. Code was a foreign language my brain refused to translate. Julian was the star of the class, a natural who saw the elegant logic where I only saw a jumble of syntax errors. He sat behind me, and one afternoon, after watching me stare at the same line of broken code for 20 minutes straight, he had leaned forward and whispered, "You're missing a semicolon." It was the first thing he ever said to me. He spent the next hour patiently walking me through the assignment, his voice a low, steady murmur that somehow made the chaos on my screen organize itself into something that made sense. He didn't make me feel stupid, he made me feel seen. That was Julian's gift. He had a way of seeing the world, of seeing people, with a kind of brilliant, uncomplicated clarity. He was a creature of motion and light, an extrovert who collected friends like I collected vintage cameras. His energy was a gravitational force, pulling people into his orbit. I, on the other hand, existed in the quiet spaces, in the shadows and the periphery. My world was one of observation, of watching light fall across a surface, of waiting for the perfect, unguarded moment to press the shutter. I lived behind a lens, both literally and metaphorically. I was more comfortable documenting life than participating in it. Our friendship, to an outside observer, probably made no sense. He was the sun, I was the planet that quietly circled him, content to live in his warmth. After college, when his lease was up and my roommate was moving out, asking him to move in with me felt like the most natural thing in the world. Our friendship had solidified into something essential, a constant in the shifting landscape of our early 20s. Our apartment became a testament to our dynamic. His side of the living room was a controlled chaos of video game controllers, half-finished consulting reports, and running shoes. My side was neat, almost monastic, stacks of photography books, a single, perfectly cared for fiddle-leaf fig, and my camera bag, always waiting by the door. We were a study in contrasts, but it worked. We built a life in that apartment, a rhythm of quiet mornings with coffee, of him recounting his day while I edited photos, of late-night movies, and ordering the same takeout every Friday. It was a comfortable, predictable domesticity that I cherished with a quiet, desperate intensity. Because, of course, there was a secret I kept locked away in the most guarded room of my own internal architecture. I was in love with him. It wasn't a sudden revelation. It was a slow, creeping dawn that I had been trying to ignore for years. It had started as a quiet admiration for his kindness, his effortless confidence. It grew into a deep, abiding affection for the person he was when the world wasn't watching. The way he'd get a small, worried frown between his eyebrows when he was concentrating. The way he'd hum tunelessly when he was cooking. The way his laughter was the most honest sound I had ever heard. And eventually, without my permission, it had bloomed into love. A hopeless, secret, and profoundly inconvenient love for my very straight, very best friend. I became an archivist of his life. My mind was a gallery of untaken photographs. Julian, asleep on the couch, sunlight from the window turning the tips of his eyelashes gold. Julian, head thrown back in laughter at something on his phone, the column of his throat exposed and vulnerable. Julian, standing in the kitchen, backlit by the morning sun, a silhouette I knew as well as my own. I kept these images for myself, developed them in the darkroom of my own mind, and never let them see the light of day. Loving him from a distance was a form of self-preservation. I had built the walls of our friendship carefully, brick by brick. The easy camaraderie, the unspoken understanding, the comfortable space we shared. It was a structure I couldn't bear to jeopardize. To confess my feelings would be to take a sledgehammer to the foundation of the most important relationship in my life. The risk of demolition was too great. The potential for ruin, absolute. So I learned to live with the quiet ache, the constant, low-grade hum of yearning. I became an expert at translating my feelings into a language he could understand. Friendship. A hand on his shoulder when he was stressed was support, not a touch I wanted to hold forever. Making him a cup of coffee in the morning was a roommate's kindness, not a small act of devotion. I existed in a state of carefully managed restraint. Our friendship was a beautiful, fragile thing, and I was its silent, vigilant guardian, protecting it from the one thing that could shatter it completely, me. Julian had girlfriends, of course. A string of them, all bright and charming and perfectly suited to him. For the last 2 years, it had been Clara. She was a lawyer, sharp and witty and ambitious. She fit into his life seamlessly. I liked her genuinely. I saw how she made him happy, and his happiness was, in a twisted way, my primary objective. I photographed their engagement party, my hand steady as I framed shots of them smiling, of her hand with the new ring resting on his chest. Each click of the shutter was a small, sharp pain, another brick in the wall of the room where I kept my feelings hidden. I learned to watch them together with a practiced, pleasant neutrality. I became the supportive friend, the third wheel who knew when to make himself scarce. I told myself that this was enough, that having him in my life in any capacity was better than not having him at all. I had convinced myself that I was content with my role as the quiet observer, the keeper of our shared history. I had built a life on the fault line of that lie, and for a long time, it had held. The first tremor that threatened this carefully constructed peace came not from me, but from him. It came on a rainy Tuesday in October. It was the day Clara ended their engagement. Julian came home late, long after the sun had set and the city lights had begun to blur behind the rain-streaked windows of our living room. I was on the couch, editing photos, the soft glow of my laptop the only light in the room. I heard his key in the lock, the familiar sound of the door swinging open, but the silence that followed was wrong. There was no cheerful, "Hey, I'm home." No sound of him dropping his work bag by the door. Just a heavy, weighted quiet. I looked up and saw him standing in the entryway, dripping water onto the welcome mat. He looked hollowed out. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale and slack. He was holding the framed photo of him and Clara that usually sat on his nightstand. He just stood there, staring at it, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't comprehend. "Jules?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He looked up, and his eyes were like shattered glass. He didn't seem to see me, not really. He looked through me. He walked across the room in a daze and sank onto the armchair opposite me. He placed the photo frame face down on the side table with a dull thud. "It's over," he said. His voice was a monotone, a flat line devoid of its usual warmth and inflection. She said she feels like we're on different paths, that she loves me, but she's not in love with me. I didn't know what to say. Every platitude, every comforting phrase that came to mind felt cheap and insufficient. So I just sat there, holding the space for his grief. The only sound for a long time was the rain against the glass and the quiet, ragged sound of his breathing. My heart ached for him, a clean, sharp pain that was entirely separate from my own complicated feelings. Seeing him broken was like watching a landmark crumble. He had always been the strong one, the one whose optimism was a force of nature. Now, that force was gone, leaving a vacuum in its place. He didn't cry. He just sat there, staring at the blank wall, his entire being radiating a profound and desolate loneliness. His world had shrunk, its axis tilted off-center, and in the disorientation of it all, he seemed to have forgotten how to move. That night was the beginning of the shift. The carefully drawn boundaries of our friendship began to blur, not with a sudden flood, but with a slow, seeping tide. His grief was a vast, quiet ocean, and he was adrift in it. And I, somehow, became his only lighthouse. He stopped going out. His usual orbit of friends called and texted, but he ignored them. He seemed to have energy only for the small geography of our apartment, the path from his bed, to the couch, to the kitchen, and back again. He started talking to me in a way he never had before. Not about the breakup, not directly. He'd talk about his work, about a memory from his childhood, about a stupid video he saw online. The words themselves were mundane, but they were a lifeline he was throwing out into the silence, just to make sure someone else was there. I became his anchor. I made sure there was always coffee in the morning. I learned to cook the comfort foods his mom used to make. I sat with him for hours while he played video games, not saying a word, just being a presence in the room. I was trying to hold the pieces of his life together, to be the steady friend he needed me to be. I told myself it was platonic. It was my duty as his best friend. But every small act of care was, for me, a secret act of love. And I knew, with a growing sense of dread and a treacherous sliver of hope, that I was in dangerous territory. The walls I had so carefully built were being tested, not by a siege from without, but by a quiet, desperate invitation from within. The ritual began on a Friday, about 3 weeks after the breakup. We were on the couch, watching some mindless action movie. It was late, past midnight. Julian had been quiet all evening, his attention drifting in and out of the film. I was intensely aware of the space between us on the worn cushions, a gap of about 6 inches that felt like a canyon. Sometime during the third act, amidst a hail of cinematic gunfire, I felt a weight against my shoulder. I glanced over. Julian had fallen asleep, his head slumping sideways until it came to rest against me. My entire body went rigid. It was an innocent, unconscious act. He was exhausted, emotionally and physically. This meant nothing. I repeated that to myself like a mantra. This means nothing. But my heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, panicked bird. I could feel the soft texture of his hair against my neck. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. I sat there, statue still, for the entire remainder of the movie, my muscles screaming in protest, terrified that if I moved, I would wake him. When the credits rolled and the living room was plunged into silence, his breathing was deep and even. I should have woken him up. I should have nudged him and told him to go to his own bed. That would have been the normal, friendly thing to do. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. The selfish, secret part of me, the part that had been starved for so long, savored the stolen intimacy. The sheer, uncomplicated weight of him was a profound comfort. It was a connection I had only ever dreamed of, and now it was here, offered up by his sleeping, unknowing body. After what felt like an eternity, I carefully, slowly, draped a blanket over him, shifted my own position just enough to get more comfortable, and resigned myself to a sleepless night on the couch, with his head on my shoulder, terrified and wanting and utterly, completely lost. That first night on the couch was the blueprint. The act repeated itself, with slight variations, over the next few weeks. He would drift off during a movie, or while we were just talking, his body seeking a point of contact, as if by instinct. A head on a shoulder became a head in a lap, a leg casually thrown over mine. Each time, I would go through the same internal war. The logical part of my brain screamed that this was just a manifestation of his grief, his desperate need for comfort from the only stable person left in his life. He wasn't choosing me. He was choosing proximity. He was choosing the warmth of another human body over the cold loneliness of his new reality. But the hopeful, traitorous part of my heart would whisper a different story. It would analyze the way his breathing deepened when he was near me, the way his hand would sometimes find mine in his sleep. It was a form of exquisite torture. I was being given a taste of everything I had ever wanted, but under a false pretense that made it both priceless and worthless at the same time. Then, the ritual escalated. It moved from the public space of the living room to the private sanctuary of my bedroom. It was a Thursday night. I was already in bed, reading. The light from my bedside lamp pooled on the pages of my book. I heard a soft knock on my door, so tentative I almost thought I'd imagined it. Leo. Julian's voice was quiet, muffled by the wood. My door was almost always slightly ajar, an old habit from living in a place with poor air circulation. It had never meant anything before. Now, that sliver of open space felt like a loaded invitation. Yeah, I called out, putting my book down. The door pushed open slowly. He stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the brighter light of the hallway. He was wearing an old t-shirt and pajama pants, and he was hugging a pillow to his chest like a shield. Sorry, he mumbled. Can't sleep. Bad dream? I asked, my voice carefully neutral. He shook his head, though he didn't look at me. He looked at the floor. No, just too quiet in my room. It's stupid. He finally looked up, and his eyes were wide and lost in the dim light. Do you mind if I just hang out in here for a bit? Until I get sleepy? The request was so vulnerable, so transparent in its neediness, that denying it would have felt like an act of cruelty. My bed was a queen, more than big enough for two, but it was also my most private space, the one place I didn't have to perform the role of just a friend. Having him in it felt like a trespass of the most dangerous kind. Sure, I heard myself say, the word feeling foreign in my own mouth. It's fine. He shuffled over and slid into the other side of the bed, over the covers, still clutching his pillow. He lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling. The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel the heat of his body across the mattress, a tangible presence that seemed to warp the very air. We lay like that for what must have been 20 minutes, two bodies in the dark, separated by a few feet of cotton sheets and a chasm of unspoken things. I pretended to read my book, but my eyes weren't processing the words. Every ounce of my awareness was focused on him, on the rise and fall of his chest, on the sound of his breathing. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Thanks, Leo. It's okay, Jules, I whispered back. Try to get some sleep. He did, eventually, and I lay awake for hours, listening to him breathe, caught in a state of agonizing bliss. That became the new ritual. 2 or 3 nights a week, there would be a soft knock, a quiet excuse. He was cold. He heard a weird noise. He just didn't want to be alone. The excuses grew thinner and thinner with each visit, until they were transparent veils over the simple, unspoken truth. He needed to be near me. He would start by lying on top of the covers, but as the nights wore on, he would eventually slide under them, his back to me, maintaining a careful, deliberate distance. But sleep is a great betrayer of intentions. In the unconscious hours of the morning, that distance would always close. I would wake up to find his arm thrown over my waist, or his back pressed firmly against mine, or, on one memorable, heart-stopping occasion, with my face buried in his hair, my own arm wrapped around him as if I had every right to. In those pre-dawn moments, in the liminal space between sleep and waking, the fantasy felt real. We were not two friends sharing a bed for comfort. We were two people who belonged together. Then the sun would rise, and the spell would break, and we would untangle ourselves with a clumsy, unspoken awkwardness, pretending it hadn't happened. It was during this period of intense, fragile intimacy that the incident in the hallway occurred. The joke that wasn't a joke. It felt different from the nighttime ritual because it happened in the light of day, fueled not by sleepy vulnerability, but by a moment of active, conscious playfulness that curdled into something else entirely. When he had me pinned against the wall, his laughing face so close to mine, it was a familiar beat. But when the laughter died and he just stayed there, searching my face for something, I saw it all. I saw the confusion that had been dogging him for weeks. I saw the reliance, the need. But underneath it, for one terrifying, breathtaking second, I saw a flicker of the same desperate wanting that lived inside of me. It was like seeing the negative of a photograph, the inverse image revealing a hidden truth. He was not just seeking comfort. He was seeking something from me, specifically. And the realization of that, dawning in his own eyes, was what scared him. That was the moment he stumbled back, the moment he fled to his room. He had accidentally held the truth up to the light, and he wasn't ready to see what was printed there. The plausible deniability we had both been clinging to had been burned away in that 3-second exposure. After that, the nighttime visits continued, but the air was different. The excuses stopped completely. He would just appear at my door, a silent question in his eyes, and I would nod and move over, and we would lie in the dark, the silence between us now humming with the electricity of what had been revealed in the hallway, and what we were both still pretending not to see. The breaking point arrived, as these things often do, not with a storm, but with an almost unbearable quiet. It was a Saturday night, nearly 2 months after the breakup. We hadn't made plans. The unspoken assumption was that we would spend the evening as we had spent so many others, in the comfortable orbit of our shared living space. We ordered pizza, sat on the floor of the living room to eat it, and talked about nothing important. The conversation was easy, but underneath it, I felt a new kind of tension, a low-frequency hum of anticipation. The hallway incident had been a week ago, and while we hadn't spoken of it, it lingered in the space between us. It was a door that had been pushed open and left ajar, and neither of us knew whether to close it or walk through it. Later, when I went to my room to read, I left my door open wider than usual. It was a conscious decision, a test, a silent question I was asking the universe. I didn't have to wait long. An hour later, he appeared in the doorway. He wasn't holding a pillow. He wasn't wearing an excuse on his face. He just stood there, his hands shoved into the pockets of his sweatpants, looking at me. His expression was stripped bare of all pretense. He just looked tired and sad and deeply, deeply uncertain. "Leo," he said, his voice so quiet I barely heard it. "Yeah," I answered, closing my book and setting it on the nightstand. My heart had begun its familiar, frantic rhythm. He took a hesitant step into the room. "Can I stay here tonight?" A small, wry smile touched my lips. It was a question he had asked a dozen times, but tonight it sounded different. The subtext had become the text. "You're already here," I said softly. He shook his head, a small, frustrated motion. He walked over to the bed, but didn't get in. He just stood beside it, looking down at me. "No," he said, his voice strained. "I mean, can I stay here? With you?" The last 2 words were almost inaudible, but they landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. He was finally saying it. He was finally admitting that this wasn't about nightmares or cold rooms. It was about me. I sat up slowly, my own movements feeling sluggish, as if I were moving through water. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the raw fear in his eyes. He was terrified. And in that moment, all my own fear, all my own carefully guarded pain, seemed to recede, replaced by a wave of profound, aching tenderness. He was just as lost in this as I was. "Jules," I said, my voice gentle, "what are we doing?" He sank down to sit on the edge of the bed, his back to me. His shoulders were tense. "I don't know," he whispered to the wall. "I don't know what I'm doing. All I know is that when I'm in my own room, it feels empty. It feels wrong. And when I'm in here, it doesn't." He finally turned to look at me, his face a portrait of conflicted misery. "Is that crazy?" "No," I said, the word coming out on a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "It's not crazy." We sat in silence for another long moment. The space between us was no longer a canyon of ambiguity, but a fragile, trembling bridge that one of us had to be brave enough to cross. He was the one who moved first. He turned his body to face me fully, his knee brushing against mine. The contact was electric, a spark in the dry tinder of the room. His eyes searched mine, and I let him look. I let him see everything I had kept hidden for years. The fear, yes, but also the depth of the wanting, the steady, unwavering line of my affection for him. I had no more walls left to hide behind. His gaze dropped to my mouth, just as it had in the hallway. This time, he didn't look away. His own breathing hitched. "Leo," he whispered, his voice cracking. Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air, so vulnerable, so painfully honest, that it stole the breath from my lungs. He was giving me the choice. He was giving me the power to protect myself, to keep the fragile piece of our friendship intact. I could have said no. I could have made a joke, deflected, and sent him back to his room, and things might have eventually returned to a semblance of normalcy. But I was so tired of normal. I was so tired of living in the quiet, gray space of my own self-denial. I didn't answer with words. I simply leaned forward, closing the last few inches between us. It was my answer and my own confession, all at once. His eyes fluttered shut, and then his lips were on mine. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss like in the movies. It was hesitant. It was tentative. It was unbelievably soft. It was a question, and a discovery, and a quiet, profound homecoming. It tasted of salt from tears I didn't realize he was shedding until I felt a single, hot drop land on my hand. It was the feeling of a lock finally turning in a door that had been sealed for a lifetime. It was everything. And as he deepened the kiss, his hand coming up to cup my jaw as if he were holding something infinitely precious, all the anxiety, all the years of silent yearning, finally went quiet. The morning after felt like waking up in a foreign country. The geography of my own bedroom was the same, the familiar slant of light cutting across the floor, the same books piled on my nightstand. But the atmosphere was entirely different. It was charged with the memory of the night before, with the ghost of a kiss that had redrawn the map of our entire world. Julian was already gone. When I had woken up, the space beside me was empty and cold. There was no note, no sign that he had been there at all, except for the faint indentation his head had left on the pillow next to mine. A hollow pit of dread opened in my stomach. I found him in the kitchen, already dressed for work, staring into a mug of coffee as if it held the answers to the universe. He didn't look up when I walked in. The easy, comfortable silence that usually filled our mornings was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Morning," he mumbled into his mug. He still wouldn't look at me. The man who had kissed me with such trembling, desperate tenderness last night was gone, and in his place was a stranger. A wall had gone up, higher and more impenetrable than any I had ever built. He moved with a stiff, unnatural economy, rinsing his mug, grabbing his keys. He was halfway to the door when he finally spoke again, his back still to me. "I'm gonna be late," he said. "See you later." The words were a dismissal, a full stop. He walked out the door, and the click of the lock behind him felt like a judgment. I spent the rest of the day in a state of suspended animation, a free fall of anxiety. I went to my darkroom, the small, windowless closet I had converted. It had always been my sanctuary, the one place I could control the world, bringing images to life out of darkness and chemicals. But today, the familiar smell of fixer and stop bath offered no comfort. I tried to develop the roll of film I had shot earlier in the week. But as I watched the images slowly appear on the paper submerged in the developer tray, his face was all I could see. Julian laughing. Julian concentrating. Julian standing in the doorway of my room. The kiss had been an exposure, bringing a hidden truth to light. And now, it seemed, he was trying to burn the negative. My hurt began to curdle into a quiet, simmering anger. It wasn't just that he was retreating, it was the way he was doing it. He was trying to invalidate the moment, to treat it like a mistake, an aberration brought on by grief that he now regretted in the sober light of day. And in doing so, he was invalidating me. He was reducing my years of silent affection and the terrifying vulnerability I had shown him to a moment of his weakness. He had knocked on my door again and again. He had crossed the threshold. He had asked the question. I had only been brave enough to answer. The unfairness of it gnawed at me. He didn't get to light the fire and then walk away, leaving me to deal with the ashes. When he came home that evening, the tension was even worse. He tried to slip past the living room and go straight to his room, but I was ready for him. I was sitting on the couch, the room dark except for a single lamp, waiting. "Jules," I said, my voice calm and steady, belying the storm inside me. He froze in the hallway, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He knew he couldn't run this time. He turned around slowly, his face etched with exhaustion and fear. "We need to talk about last night," I said. It wasn't a request. He let out a long, shaky breath and came to sit in the armchair across from me, the same chair he had collapsed into the night Clara left him. He looked just as broken now as he had then. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at his hands, which were clenched into tight fists in his lap. "Leo, I'm so sorry," he whispered. The words were a knife in my gut. Sorry for what? Sorry for kissing me? Or sorry for wanting to? Sorry for what exactly? I asked, my voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel I rarely used. "You're going to have to be more specific." He finally looked up at me, his eyes swimming with a miserable confusion. "For everything. For messing with your head. For taking advantage of our friendship. I'm a mess, Leo. I haven't been thinking straight since Clara left. I've just been so lonely. And you were there. You were so good to me, and I used that. I used you. And it wasn't fair. Last night was a mistake." Every word was a carefully aimed blow. Used you. A mistake. It was exactly what my deepest, most terrified insecurities had been screaming at me all day. For a moment, I felt the floor give way. But then, the anger returned, clarifying and sharp. He was building a narrative, a story he could live with, where he was the grieving friend who made a regrettable error and I was the convenient, temporary comfort. It was a lie. I had been there in the hallway. I had been there last night. I had seen the look in his eyes. It wasn't the look of someone using a friend. It was the look of someone falling. "No," I said, and the word was so firm it made him flinch. "You don't get to do that." "Do what?" he asked, his voice small. "You don't get to rewrite this," I said, leaning forward. "You don't get to make this all about your grief, to file it away as some kind of temporary insanity. It's insulting, not just to me, but to you. I know you, Julian, better than anyone. You don't do things you don't mean. You are not that careless with people." I paused, letting the words sink in. "So I'm going to ask you again, and I want you to tell me the truth. Not the story you think you're supposed to tell. The truth. Why did you kiss me?" The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked away, then back at me. I could see the war playing out across his face, the desperate desire to cling to the easy explanation versus the terrifying pull of the truth. I just waited, my gaze unwavering. I would not let him look away. I would not let him hide. He had spent weeks hiding in my room, in my presence. There was no more hiding. Finally, his carefully constructed composure shattered. His face crumpled, and he buried it in his hands. His voice, when it came, was muffled and broken. "I don't know," he sobbed, the sound raw and painful. "I don't know. I had to. I look at you, and I feel safe. It's not just since Clara. It's always been there, I think. You're the only person who is just quiet with me, who doesn't need anything from me." And somewhere, I don't know when, that feeling it changed. It started to feel like coming home. Kissing you. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever done. And for a second, it felt right. It felt more right than anything with Clara ever did. And that scares the hell out of me, Leo. What does that mean? What does that make me? I've spent my whole life on this one track, and now I don't even know who I am. His confession, so full of fear and turmoil, extinguished my anger completely, leaving only a vast, aching empathy in its place. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He wasn't afraid of what he'd done to our friendship. He was afraid of what his feelings for me revealed about his own identity, an identity he had never thought to question. He had spent his life seeing the world in a clear, logical way, and for the first time, he was looking at his own reflection and seeing a stranger. The kiss hadn't been a mistake. It had been a revelation, and it had broken him. I got up from the couch, walked over to his chair, and knelt in front of him. I gently pulled his hands away from his face. His eyes were red, his face streaked with tears. He looked impossibly young and completely lost. I didn't say anything. I just took his hand, my thumb tracing circles on his skin, and waited for him to stop shaking. The conversation that followed our confrontation was not a single, cathartic event. It was a process. It unfolded over days and then weeks, in quiet moments in the kitchen while coffee brewed, on long walks through the city at night when the darkness offered a cloak of anonymity, and in the familiar, safe space of my bedroom, where the talking now felt as intimate as any touch. Julian talked, and for the first time, I felt like I was truly listening, not just as a friend, but as a partner in this strange, new territory we found ourselves in. He unspooled the tangled knot of his confusion, his fear, his deeply ingrained assumptions about what his life was supposed to look like. He admitted that his relationship with Clara had felt more like a partnership, a logical next step, than a deep, soulful connection. He confessed that my quiet presence in his life had been a silent anchor for years, a source of stability he had taken for granted until it was the only thing left. I listened, and I learned to be patient. I understood that he was grieving not just the end of his engagement, but the end of the person he thought he was. I gave him space to be scared, to be uncertain. I didn't push for labels or definitions. My own confession had been made long ago, in 1,000 unspoken ways. It was his turn to find his own language for what he was feeling. My role shifted from the quiet observer to a quiet guide, holding a lamp for him as he navigated the unfamiliar landscape of his own heart. I answered his questions, the hesitant, fearful ones. Does this make me? What will people? What if I'm just confused? I answered them with honesty. I don't know. We'll figure it out. It's okay to be confused. The only thing I asked of him was that he not run away again. From me, or from himself. Slowly, tentatively, a new normal began to emerge. It was built not on assumptions or pretenses, but on a foundation of deliberate, spoken honesty. The physical intimacy returned, but this time it was different. It was intentional. A hand held as we walked down the street was no longer a secret hope of mine, but a mutual decision. Cuddling on the couch during a movie was no longer an ambiguous act of comfort, but an open expression of affection. The first time he kissed me again, it was in the bright light of the kitchen on a Sunday morning. There was no preamble, no hesitation. He just turned from the stove, a smear of flour on his cheek, and kissed me with a simple, easy certainty that was more reassuring than any grand declaration. It was a kiss that said, "This is real. This is us now." The nighttime ritual changed, too. He didn't stop coming to my room, but he no longer hesitated in the doorway. He would just walk in, as if it were his own, and climb into bed. There was no more careful distance, no more lying on opposite sides of the mattress. We would find each other in the dark naturally, our bodies fitting together with a familiarity that felt both brand new and ancient. We learned the rhythm of each other's sleep, the weight and warmth of a shared bed becoming a profound source of peace rather than a source of agonizing tension. One evening, a few months into this new, fragile chapter, I was walking down the hall and noticed that the door to his bedroom was closed. He was in my room, reading a book while I edited photos, our legs tangled together. He had been slowly moving his things in, a toothbrush in my bathroom, a stack of his favorite books on my nightstand, his favorite hoodie draped over my desk chair. His own room had become a guest room, a space he no longer inhabited. I paused and looked at my own door, which was wide open, spilling light into the hallway. And I remembered the night of the hallway incident, the way he had fled and closed his door, a definitive, panicked click that had echoed in my heart. Tonight, I walked over to my own door and gently pushed it shut. The soft click it made wasn't a sound of separation. It was a sound of arrival. It was the sound of two people consciously, deliberately, choosing to be in the same room together. There are spaces we build to protect ourselves, rooms within our own hearts with walls so high and doors so securely locked that we forget we even hold the key. We furnish them with fear, with self-denial, with the quiet, persistent lie that it is safer to live alone with our secrets than to risk the beautiful, terrifying demolition that love requires. For years, I lived in a fortress of my own making, content to be the lonely guardian of a friendship I was too afraid to lose. I thought the greatest risk was speaking the truth. I was wrong. The greatest risk is a life lived in a room with no windows, a place where the light can never get in. Julian, in his own blind, stumbling way, didn't just knock on my door. He showed me that the door was never really locked at all. He reminded me that a home isn't a structure of wood and plaster. It's a space you build with someone else, a place of shared silence and profound peace. And in the beautiful, honest quiet of the world we learned to create together, we finally began to heal.